bias sort of contributes to a sort of simplified black and white thinking, right? If my beliefs and convictions are right, then others who think the opposite of me, they must be wrong. There's just no middle ground here. And not only factually wrong, but often even morally wrong. So there's an even deeper kind of moral good and evil level to binary biases. And it's binary bias that prevents us from seeing and understanding the complexity of problems that we want to fix, and it even blocks us from seeing that a problem does in fact exist. And confirmation bias, that occurs when our brains reject information that conflicts with our understanding of what is true and our understanding of how things are supposed to be. So we avoid information that challenges our worldview, and we actively seek out information that reinforces our opinions and our belief system. Confirmation bias, it encourages us to see what we expect to see, quite simply, to hear what we expect to hear and screen out everything else. Nobody can be completely free of these biases. Why is that? Well, they serve a functional purpose. They help us feel safe in a complicated, uncertain, and changing world. And again, that's why deep canvassing is so powerful, because it allows us the possibility of bypassing these natural biases, these sort of natural reactions, and connecting on an emotional level. Okay, one more bias thing I want to sort of throw at you. And this can be described as sort of the trusted messenger loop. Confirmation bias contributes to the trusted messenger loop in the following way, right? I am more likely to believe people who repeat and reinforce what I want to believe is true. So this is especially true if my beliefs are sort of if I feel my beliefs have been marginalized or rejected by the mainstream. And so think no further than Donald Trump here. He gave voice to viewpoints that were rejected or that were felt to be rejected by people who voted for him, or were believed to be rejected because that's what the GOP messaging machine told them, that the coastal elites and the mainstream media don't care about your views. And Donald Trump, just by appearing to hear those viewpoints and then repeating them, became a very powerful figure and somebody who could lie 30,000 times over the course of 4 years, but still be a trusted messenger to certain groups of folks, right? And so one way that we can apply this insight to deep canvassing is to think about how we can use certain tactics to become more trustworthy messengers ourselves with the people we encounter, but just doing it from a much firmer ethical viewpoint. Okay, so we don't know the facts. So now we know facts don't change people's minds. So what does change people's minds? This is a little more complicated. So we're going to ask you to explore this a little bit. In a moment, Olga is going to put you into breakout rooms. And in those breakout rooms, we want you to do two things. We want you to introduce yourselves, and we want you to answer this question. Now, think about a moment when you changed your mind on something deep. What made that possible? Right? So we're not asking you what you changed your mind on, although that's an obvious place to start. But when you changed your mind, what was the context? What was going on? How did that happen over a long period of time, over a short period of time? What do you think made that possible? Okay, so I'm going to hand you all off to Olga's technical wizardry, and she's going to put you in breakout rooms for how long, Olga?
Let's go ahead and do 5 minutes. And you all should be in about groups of 3 or 4. All right, ready, set. We'll be back at 32.
somebody wrote some great lines in the chat. And one was, please don't tell me I have to start watching Fox News to be good at deep values canvassing.
Turns out you don't have to.
Thankfully, we weren't heading in that direction. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so there's still 13 participants, 12. So minus the 4 of us, down to 11.
Yeah, Erica, Ellen, did you all get a breakout room invitation? Lori, John, Cynthia, Debbie. I'm going to go ahead and join breakout room 7 really quickly because it looks like they're asking for help.
Okay.
Scott, let me make you, Trisha's a co-host, so she can also help with breakout rooms but I'll make you a co-host too, and Afton you as well. Okay, so I'll be back.
Okay.
Follow up on my crafts. Hi, Olga.
Hi, did you all need help? I think.
So we're just introducing ourselves, and then we need to think about what something where we changed our mind and what made that possible.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Okay, we're on track so far.
Awesome. Awesome. I'll hop out just to make sure everybody else is good, but please keep going.
Okay, thanks. Okay, somebody else.
Oh, maybe I don't want to say it. Oh, well, I'm glad that and it took, I think, a lot of just understanding of systemic issues, and that our system and our country is not built for women to have children and for there to be families and for there to be food on the table. And so but that's one that I'm always like, wow, I can't believe I thought that.
It's wild. I think the thing that sort of changed things for me was when I moved to Guatemala for 6 or 7 months, and being an outsider and just really sort of observing the hierarchies of society around race and class and ethnicity and religion, and made me so much more sensitive to like how hierarchies are created by people making decisions and policies. And coming back to the United States then after 7, 8 months, it just was so, I was just primed to see and hear about how hierarchies were created in this country. And it just made me that much more, aware of just what a lot of people were going through. Olga, we were deciding we were going to share in the main room.
I think that's a great solution. Yeah. What are some other answers to that question? What is it that made you change your mind?
Scott said travel. I said reading and systemic. Who else do we have in here? Anyone else want to come off mute? Nancy, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Looking for the mute button.
Nancy, if you're on your iPad, you might be able to tap the bottom of the screen and the bar should show up. If you're on your Zoom app. Olga, is that right? I see you nodding.
It should. Okay, Nancy, I think you're off mute now.
Oh, well, we are having all kinds of difficulties. My friend Jan Tivol and I are with 2 different computers, and anyway, so I haven't heard a thing that you've said until it said unmute.
We were welcoming you.
We
were welcoming you, and I was about to mention that your surname is my son's middle name, Llewellyn.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'm Nancy Llewellyn, and this is my friend Jan Tivol sitting next to me. We were using her laptop to try and join one meeting, and then had problems with my laptop, but now we'll see how things go.
Well, welcome to the space, Nancy. And welcome back, everybody else. I think we've got folks trickling back in, closing out the breakout rooms. And as you're coming back in, please jump into the chat box. Let us know, what were some of those, what did you all talk about in your breakout rooms? What were the reasons, or what is it that motivated you, allowed you to change your mind on something important in your life in the past? I'll give you all a moment. I know it can be a lot to kind of reflect in the chat box sometimes.
Are you wanting us to chat our replies?
Yeah, although Erica, if you're off mute, go ahead. What was something, what did you all talk about in your breakout room?
Well, one person had actually a very sort of like rational information-based process, but like having a trusted messenger seemed crucial. In another case, it was feeling like there was, well, this was actually for me, like I had permission to change my mind about something, because even though maybe not all progressives agreed with me, I found some other progressives who did. So there was like the safety of finding my own new team. And then someone else talked about personal stories, like accepting the reality of white skin privilege from hearing people's personal stories.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, small group, if I'm forgetting any of the others.
That's great. Thank you, Erica. And I see some of what you're talking about reflected in the chat box as well. We've got experiences like Vietnam, BLM, the 1619 Project, so reading and kind of understanding history in a more truthful way than maybe we did it, when I was growing up in school anyway. The most powerful change agent for me was knowing people I cared about who were impacted. So actually, becoming friends with people who have different experiences from you and realizing how they live in the world and how they exist in the world. We were mentioning how our relationships with our friends, LGBTQ plus evolution, absolutely being listened to without being berated or challenged, exposed to actual people who bust one's preconceptions. All of these answers are really great. I'll go ahead and jump back into the share. Could you all confirm with me, do you see the PowerPoint now? Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, the truth is that there are many situations that help us change our minds, and that most of the time, the process of changing our minds is actually a lifelong process or a lifelong journey. However, when it does happen in a conversation, which is hard to create, but when it does happen in a conversation, it's often because the person who changed their mind felt heard. So what we know is that the process of feeling heard in my current views is what brings down my defenses and allows me to be open to a new idea. But here's the thing, how do you elicit this feeling of being heard? In order to elicit a feeling of being heard, we, the organizers, the canvassers, have to listen without judgment. Which brings us to the first paradoxical, or well, the only paradoxical mindset, but one of the things about deep canvassing is that we're kind of holding two things on at the same time. On one hand, we know we have to listen without judgment so that the person can feel heard and that we're really kind of having this type of connection. But we also want to move this person towards our side. And more than likely, if we're talking to them, it's because we are kind of trying to convince them of something. And so here's our advice to you to kind of keep in mind when you're having these conversations, is to set your mind towards understanding rather than convincing. So instead of approaching the conversation from a point of view of, oh, I'm going to convince this person of X, it's really just, I'm going to understand fully where you're coming from. And then it's actually from this place of mutual understanding that we're able to move that person to our side. So let's explore this a little bit more. Here are the 5 steps of a deep canvassing conversation. And again, like we said before, these may not be 100% applicable to every single instance, but for the most part, this is what makes, this is what we believe makes really strong deep canvassing conversations and what a lot of other organizations use as their methodology. First, you got to start by beginning the conversation. It seemed pretty simple, but in some cases, this might be a pretty structured or formal introduction if you don't know who the person is who you're talking to. If you're talking to a stranger, hello, my name is Olga. I'm a volunteer with Indivisible DC, and we're talking to DC residents today about their healthcare. And, you know, simple, quick, clear about what you're talking about. If you're talking to someone you already know, you may not be introducing yourself, but you're still narrowing the conversation. Because the bottom line is that deep canvassing conversations are focused. We're not necessarily listening about, we're not trying to find out everything about this person's life. We're having a particular conversation on an issue at hand. So once you've begun the conversation, we move into empathetic listening. This is the core of what we're talking about today. But here are kind of 4 top-line things that we'll dig into even further. In this step, we're really asking open-ended questions. We're listening more than we're talking. We're guessing at the needs and the feelings behind the person's story, and we're letting our curiosity kind of lead us. After that, we switch into sharing our story and vision, where we're really we're showing a vision of what the world could be like through our organizing efforts and in the work that we're doing, and also sharing a story that's relevant to the conversation you've been having so far with the voter. At which point, that brings us to reconciling conflicting views, because oftentimes when we're having deep canvassing conversations, we are going to unearth some things that just don't feel like they quite align at first. And so giving space in the conversation to really deal with conflicting views is pretty important. And then finally, it's the call to action. This can vary quite a bit depending on what your campaign is and what your needs are. It can be as simple as a question like, next time this issue is on the ballot, how will you be voting? So kind of a future kind of prediction of how the person's likely to act. Or it could be something really specific, like call your senator, join an Indivisible group. Again, it just totally depends on what the goals of your deep canvassing conversations are. But no matter what, it's the second step of empathetic listening that really allows us to make the person feel heard, because it turns out, takes listening to a person for them to really feel heard. So these are 100% linked in the conversation. All right, which brings us to part 3, skill building. We will be talking about nonviolent communication, because it's a methodology that allows us to really hone in on what it means to empathetically listen. So we're going to kind of take a little bit of a detour now, if folks will allow me to do this. Please keep in mind the deep canvassing conversation in your back pocket, but for a moment, we're just going to go down nonviolent communication lane, if you will, and come right back to deep canvassing. How does this sound? I get some nods from people. All right, we got some nods going on. Okay, great. Is anyone familiar with the concept of nonviolent communication? I'll go ahead and open up the chat to see. Heard about it from Melinda. Oh, Liz, Christy. Okay, excellent. Madeline, Patricia, lots of folks. Oh, people took classes. Okay, excellent. Please feel free to jump into the chat box and contribute at any moment, but especially in this section if you have a lot of experience. So nonviolent communication at its broadest is a life philosophy, and at its smallest, it's kind of a communication framework. And what it believes, NVC, which is the acronym for nonviolent communication, believes that every action a human being takes is done to meet a need. So this includes every single tweet that Donald Trump tweeted while he was in the White House was trying to meet a need, even if we didn't understand it. The fact that, you're knocking on someone's door and maybe they turn off the light and don't answer the door. They're meeting a need in that moment when you're trying to have a canvassing conversation with them. And of course, all of you joining us today, you are meeting a need. So a natural next question might be, what are needs? Well, the man who wrote the book on nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, defines needs as the resources life requires to sustain itself. And there are a lot of different needs. In fact, we'll be sharing a handout with you all later on in today's session, but I just wanted to pull out 3 categories of needs to kind of give you a little bit of an idea. So we have things like under connection, we have a need for acceptance, belonging, community, love, respect. Under meaning, we have things like challenge, clarity, creativity, growth, self-expression. And under autonomy, we have things like choice, a need for freedom, a need for independence, a need for space or spontaneity. And the way that this kind of gets applied in the nonviolent communication context, let's take an example. Let's say that I have a cousin named Bob, and my cousin Bob has been sending me a lot of articles, but from the stretches of the internet and YouTube videos and memes on what I see as a conspiracy theory, but what he is sharing to me as fact. It could be that my cousin is sharing this information with me out of a need for acceptance, that he wants me to accept him in his new beliefs. It could be that he's doing this out of a need for self-expression because he is in fact the one who's making some of these memes. It could be that he's moving from a place of autonomy and independence, of trying to, of needing to feel independent from his current community. Of course, these are just examples. We would need to actually talk to my cousin Bob to know what it is that's really motivating his needs, but it gives you an idea of the way that the relationship kind of goes, that these types of needs can in fact result to actions. And the reason that we know that these are universal is because, I mean, let's take acceptance, for example. If you all could jump into the chat box, I'd love to know, have you ever felt a need for acceptance in your life? Debbie says yes. Nancy, always. Thank you, Nancy. It's always for me too. I always need to feel accepted. Yes, absolutely. Of course, many times, absolutely. I'm going to be really surprised if anyone says no, because that's why we know that these needs are universal. We may not all feel them at the same time, but all of us feel them at some point in our lives. Okay, so why are we going down nonviolent communication lane? Why are we talking about nonviolent communication in the context of a deep canvassing training? Well, the reason is because when we understand that needs are the ones that are moving our behavior, that needs drive our human behavior, as organizers, we can use this knowledge to have better organizing conversations. We can compel action in a more effective way by understanding this about human behavior. But also there's kind of a second reason, which I think connects really well to rural deep canvassing. I grew up in a rural community, so I'm just saying this off of my own experience. I'd be curious to know if your experiences, those of you who are here from a rural community or the rural caucus, if it's the same. But from my experience, the thing that makes rural communities particularly unique is the fact that your universe is small. So you don't have a huge amount of people that you can knock on the doors of. You kind of have one, if you're talking in your own community, you have kind of a smaller set of people. And as a result, I have found that it can be a little bit intimidating, or it can be an extra layer of intimidation to have these types of conversations. But here's a really cool thing about nonviolent communication is it helps us de-escalate. It helps us have heartfelt conversations on difficult topics without necessarily having the conversation explode and go in a bad direction. And so I think in general, nonviolent communication, that's not only applicable to rural communities, this is true across the board, but I do think it gives an extra amount of kind of knowledge and skill building for everybody who's having who's having these types of conversations in a smaller community overall. Okay, so let's continue with these definitions. Empathetic listening, really quickly, what step in the deep canvassing conversation was empathetic listening? Anyone remember? Oh, and Liz, I completely agree. It is a great skill for beyond life. Everybody's right. Adriana, Eliana, Marnie, absolutely. It's step 2. So here's how we define empathetic listening. the practice of being attentive and responsive to others' input during a conversation. And to kind of show you this a little bit more practically, I'm going to ask everyone to close your eyes if you're comfortable. If you're willing to do this with me, I'll go ahead and close my eyes myself. And go ahead and bring your attention inward to your body. Bring your attention up to your head. Notice, do you have a lot of tension in your forehead? What are your eyebrows like? Are they really squinched together, or are they nice and relaxed? And now open up your eyes on your next breath in and look around your room, whatever room you happen to be in. Pay attention to the sounds. Do you hear anything else except for the sound of my voice? What colors do you see? And on your next breath in, go ahead and bring your attention back into your body. And then bring it down from your forehead and your crown to your neck, to your shoulders. Do you have any tension in your back? To your hips, and all the way down to your feet. And then open up your eyes, bring it back to the Zoom room. Who is it that you see on your screen? I see Nancy and Morris and Carissa. And here's the thing, is that our attention is a tool. And so we can point it internally to any single part of our body, but it's also a tool that we can point towards other people. And that's what empathetic listening is. Empathetic listening is about moving your attention away from yourself and pouring it fully onto the person who you're talking to in order to get as much information as possible in order to have an effective conversation. So here next is a list of very common practices that are very useful in conversation, but are not actually empathy. And pretty oftentimes, these are the kinds of practices that we rely on in conversation. What do I mean by this? Giving advice and starting to fix, which could look like, oh, hey, well, here's what I would do in your situation when someone's telling you something they're frustrated with. That's not empathy. Neither is analyzing and diagnosing. This is a really big one for me personally. I like to ask follow-up questions to figure out what's going on. This is not empathy. Neither is telling your story or one-upping, which is like telling a story to make the person feel better because you're like, oh, but listen to this thing happened to me and it's much worse. Not empathy. Offering sympathy by being sorry for the person, or making them feel better by reassuring them, or even commiserating by agreeing. None of those are actually empathy. I want to actually pause here for a second and just get reactions from folks, clarifications, heck, pushback. Because we know that this can, I know the first time I read this and learned about this, it felt a little bit surprising because these are some very steadfast kind of tactics and uses that we have in conversation, communication tactics. However, empathy is something really specific, which is our attention towards somebody else. Okay, let's see, I'm jumping into the chat box to see. Doesn't leave much else. Ooh, Pam, that's such a great carryover. I'll show you what it does leave. I promise it does leave a little bit. For those who grew up in the South, this is hard. Absolutely, regional differences will make, yeah, I mean, regional differences are very real. So if this is something you're particularly attuned to doing, it will be a little bit difficult to change. Yes, so we do have one question from Liz. Can you please say more about the last one on the list? Commiserating by agreeing. So that would look like someone's telling me that they, whatever it is that they have a challenge with, let's say that they voted for Donald Trump because they are, they feel like their industry fell apart. In this case, I could commiserate by agreeing by saying, oh yeah, I didn't vote for Donald Trump. So that's actually a horrible example, but commiserating by agreeing would be just validating what they're saying by actually saying, yes, I agree with you. I understand why you're upset. I would be upset too. Liz, did that clarify despite my bad example there at the beginning? Okay, great. Excellent. What if I just say, I understand? So Nancy, I'm going to go ahead and jump us into the next slide here because it's a beautiful kind of question. So here's what we can do to actually be empathetically listening, to use empathy in a conversation, is that we turn our attention away from ourselves and towards the other person. So it's not really about making I statements or telling your story necessarily, because that's that attention coming back towards us. It's about turning our attention outwards. Second, we want to give physical cues of our listening while staying silent. I do think one of these verbal cues that you could give, actually, excuse me, I jumped ahead a little too early, a verbal cue that you could give your question, Nancy, I do think you could say, I understand, without continuing to kind of move the conversation in a different direction. And that could be a verbal cue that doesn't actually move away from empathy necessarily. When we do speak, unless we're giving that kind of verbal cue to let the person know that we're listening, we are verbally guessing at the feelings and needs behind what the other person is telling us. And then when we're guessing at the feelings and needs, we listen for the correction from the other person. So for example, if someone's telling me a story about how they're really frustrated at work, let's say, and something bad has happened to them, their supervisor's treating them badly, let's say. And I say, oh, it sounds like, it sounds like you might even be angry, like you're really, like you don't want to be there anymore. And if the person says, actually, I'm not angry, I'm hurt, that kind of correction is incredibly important for us to understand what's really going on for that person. So we're guessing at the feelings and needs, but we're actually allowing ourselves to be wrong and correcting our assumption there whenever the person lets us know what's really going on. Okay, so I think it might be good to give this a little bit of a try. I'm gonna stop sharing just for a moment that I can see all of you again, and then ask for a volunteer. Do we have a brave volunteer who would be willing to share just something that's frustrating you right now, that's causing you, that's alive in you, to use nonviolent communication kind of language? And we'll pause the recording just because this, doesn't have to be on the recording necessarily, and then I'll be the empathizer to show you all kind of the distinction that I'm talking about. Any volunteers? Oh, great, Susan. Was your hand for this activity and not something
I
sooner?
think that might have been left over and
Well, Marnie, I won't put you on. Okay, there we go. Amy. Yeah, excellent. Hey, thanks for volunteering.